First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Dwarkanath, Professor Asha, for having me over to really moderate this panel of heavyweights. Uh, Again, I would use this opportunity to really express my deep gratitude to the entire conference organizing committee of this conference, Dr. Preetham Singh, a gentleman who has left a deep impact with his thought and action on all of us, and many of us, do, live to those principles that he established for all of us. So, thank you so much for having me over. In fact, when Mr. Dwarkanath had invited me and the topic that itself to me was the first challenge. The second was when I got to know all the panelists who are going to share their thoughts, then it gave me a bit of a comfort because I thought I have 90 minutes. And if I were to just give them 15, 20 minutes each, my job is done because I really don't have much to really say when you have the best of the best, that Professor Asha and Mr. Dwarkanath have lined up. So, so we try and see how best we can. I think time is the only constraint. I'm sure there's so much of, ideas and thoughts that I'm sure my co-panelists would love to share. So I just thought a brief opening, comment, and I would probably lay out the issues, and then maybe we could deliberate on some of these challenges. It's again a very large topic. The topic is fintech, financial inclusion, and data governance. Each of these topics are per se today conference, kind of topics, but we have all three of them, and we have 90 minutes to deliver, some outcome here. So let me get going. Clearly, technology has got redefined, and especially in the financial services, in the way it's getting offered to the customer. The role of fintechs clearly, cannot be overemphasized. The triad of technology, financial, the finance and data sciences has really powered and created a lot of impact in the financial services space today. Fintechs, I'm told, today is home to about 6,000 plus fintechs in India, and we have close to about $2,000 billion worth of reported investments in India. So clearly, I mean, there is no doubt about the fact that they have redefined the whole, landscape for us. Now, what do we do? And I was just thought I have written down some of the, opening remarks, and then I'm sure we'll have the panelists to really deliberate on them. One of the key influencers clearly in this whole, process has been the availability of a large public digital infrastructure such as Aadhaar, and delighted to have, people who really worked on this project directly to be part of this panel today. And, and the whole UPI, integration that's happened into the payment space. The regulators too have taken numerous steps, to really ensure that enhanced accountability and uninterrupted availability of services and affordable digital solutions are available. As we explore this theme, I was just wanting the panelists to maybe keep some in mind some of these thoughts. A lot has been talked in the space of payments, identity verification services, etc. Can fintechs really break the glass ceiling to get into the space which is largely dominated, by banks and other financial institutions? I'm not for one suggesting that they can is such a wrong question. How much of disruption will they actually cause in the banking space? I think is one question that came up to my mind. Again, the second question that came up was, India has many Indias. Again, a controversial comment lately. We should see it in context. And, it's diverse and it's digitally divided as well. Inclusion has many dimensions. Can technology really help us deliver this whole last mile execution when it comes to financial inclusion? I think that's one big, discussion that we could probably have. The operating context that we need to really have to really hold the environment while idea generation or idea incubation happens. I think the whole operating context has many factors to it. It has factors such as regulatory, requirements, availability of skilled resources, readiness of customers to accept change, the digital infrastructure of the nation, and many others. So what are the necessary support structures that are really required to really build this operating environment so that we really are able to really further push this whole fintech revolution in the country. Now, the aspect that really has come up into center of debate is this whole debate on data governance and privacy. And that's a very classical debate of how to really balance it, because, as we look at, data, and if you look at unregulated use of data, I think it also leads to a lot of innovation in that space, because today, the way data and digital and technology is being used, it really helps us to serve a lot of customer needs in a very efficient manner. But however, if you look at the other extreme of it, and if it was highly regulated in a sense, would it come at the cost of innovation as such? So what is this right balance between, having access to data and having regulations around, and how will this come in the way of innovation? Is a classic debate that I hear many experts having. And also India's personal data protection bill is already introduced. And so what would really constitute the right data framework, and what should be the right balance, I think would be a very interesting input that we could seek out of our panel colleagues. Again, data is a great currency, and how has usage of data and technology platforms led to generation of value to the nation, or to the customers? And can we further, really leverage on it, and how can it be leveraged to customize solutions? I think is again one area that we thought we could explore. The last point, again contextual in India, given the fact that there's a huge amount of articles now in the media on this whole great retention versus resignation and attrition and attraction. I think that's a massive space. So skilled labor, availability of skilled labor, these spiraling costs which are there, given the fact that there's a huge demand for this kind of skill, and and how really can India structurally intervene to make sure that we are able to supply the right level of skilled manpower to really fuel this whole revolution that's happening around us, and also in some sense disrupt this whole spiraling of costs that we could get into if we don't really have our supply lines fixed when it comes to skilled manpower. So I guess, a whole range of, I would say, issues that one could explore. But let me probably start with the first question to Mr. Rajesh Bansal. Mr. Rajesh, as a country, we have, UPI, the account aggregation, GSTN network, digital health and land record, etc. All these platforms create, a lot of data. How do you see this transforming the growth of financial services and fintech in the next few years?
Thanks, Srirang, and thanks to Dr. Asha for inviting me. My apologies, I think I'm traveling and Chennai rains are playing havoc with my Wi-Fi. So I hope I don't log out again. So see, the point is that India has obviously built the world's largest ID infrastructure. UPI, as the world talks about, build account aggregator, which has launched recently, and GSTN. However, 2-3 points before I come to data. The point is, my concern has been that this is still touched not even half the population of India. And talking about the adult population, I mean, let's not even go to GSTN. Only Aadhaar is the one which has touched 1.3 billion people, UPI 150 million unique users. So there is, first of all, a very long way to go. So these, infrastructure, the public infrastructure that has been built is definitely helping if I can say, the top 300 million get access to instant payment system, digital systems, as well as, credit formally. Now, there are two aspects. First, let's focus on the 300 million. For the 300 million, the fintechs are playing an important role in collating this data. And I was talking to the account aggregator guys yesterday. The GSTN integration has still not happened. So for the micro and small enterprises to actually get loans based on actual invoices is still not there. So these are gaps which need to be filled in as far as data access is concerned. Yes, all these data elements put together have the potential to provide extensive financial products over the next few years. Another caveat, the personal data protection bill needs to be passed. Hopefully the government is working on it actively to ensure that data is used responsibly. So, and if you can allow me one more minute on the next 600 million adults.
Mr. Rajesh, what I was thinking is that, just to get your thoughts across all the points that we discussed, and you can have maybe up to 4 or 5 minutes each. And maybe we could have each of the panelists, have their opening remarks so that, we get your thoughts on table, and then maybe we could flow with a few more questions. So you could please go ahead, Rajesh, and take up to 5 minutes. Please
no, I didn't realize when you must have mentioned this and I dropped out. So one of the critical elements that I talk about is, as I said, the top 300 million, where they have a digital footprint and they have various options and data which could be leveraged by the financial service providers. However, all of this and the fintechs and the innovation has not touched the lives of the bottom next half billion, if I can call it. So that is one concern that I have, and we can talk about it later as we discuss it. The other thing is that we as a country have still not done enough as far as, how do we get digital footprint of the physical, the 600 million who still transact physically. There are ways and options which we can discuss over this. And one of the last things I would say is that how, as a country, honestly, I've worked in about 15 markets globally. We are the best place to be able to, actually launch ourselves from here over the infrastructure that we built over the last 10 years in this decade to become a digital economy. That's what I would like to say.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Rajesh. Now, can I have Mr. Vasudev, your 5 minutes, sir, on your overall take on the topic FinTech, financial inclusion, data governance?
Great. Well, thank you to all of you, and especially Professor Bhandarkar to include me in this panel. My focus on my comments will be on explaining the digital stack as I understand it in the context of some of the issues you've raised. I agree with my colleagues that India has made great progress, especially in setting up the unique identifiers for individuals and for the population, and especially with biometric facilities set up. This makes every citizen easily accessible and addressable from top to bottom. However, what I'd like to talk about is the whole technology stack that enables all of these applications to be implemented. So just to step back, so what are the applications and application areas in in the fintech space? If you look at the gamut of fintech systems, starting with banking, we hear about banking, we hear about payments, but we don't hear about the security infrastructure. You don't hear about the regulatory infrastructure. You don't hear about AI and machine learning and the risks associated with that. And last but not the least, you don't hear about the edge technologies that are used to connect with individuals. For all of these systems have to be in place before we can think about acceleration of financial inclusion. I was impressed that, for example, Ms. Shinjini has created companies that help the people who most need to be in the system but who are not there, which is the 50% of the population. With that said, I would say that there are we often talk about using technology at the front end, so there are systems of engagement, there are systems of intelligence, and systems of record. And that's the, the three-layer system that I would start off with. And systems of intelligence, systems of engagement are the systems that are in place, whether the company or the application is in the US, or whether it's in India, or whether it's in Indonesia. These systems are the same everywhere, and technology is a great leveler. And the technology deck, the technology stack is the same all over the world. And furthermore, because the internet is a great leveler, everyone has access. There is no advantage any company has in any part of the world. Information is all available. So I would say that number one thing that you need in the systems of engagement is a fair and intelligent and scalable system that connects the consumers of the product, whether it is payments or whether it is banking, connects the payment and the consumers to the providers, which are the companies or the institutions. And in between, there are the regulatory entities, the bots, the mobile devices, and in essence, any application that is implemented and any system that is implemented is a three-way recommendation system. What FinTech has done is it has advanced the concepts from two-way recommendations to three-way recommendations, and for harmonious implementation of these applications such that everybody's included, you need to have a three-way recommendation system where the offers that are made by the banks are matched intuitively to the consumers who want to consume them using a regulatory framework or an intermediary framework. With that said, there are other aspects taking the system up to the next level. You talk about systems of engagement. Now you have systems of intelligence. The intelligence that we are talking about is keeps track of the AI that comes into place, whether you call it a rules-based system from 15 years ago or the artificial intelligence systems that use data, and all of these are data-driven. So in other words, they're data-driven and without human intervention. So all of these, the systems of intelligence can then mediate between the systems of engagement at the top with the consumer to the systems of record at the bottom, which are all the historical data sets and all of the databases and that are available throughout the system. So so I would think of the technology stack in terms of those areas. Now, once you have the technology stack described that way, then you can go from bottom to top. You can go using customer segmentation, clustering risk models, which are common across all of the FinTech applications, whether it's commercial banking or retail banking or insurance or asset management. You extract the risk metrics across these, and then you then have both large and small companies implement specific applications. The 6,000 applications that companies that you talked about, whether it's fraud systems or cross-sell or collection systems, preventive maintenance, churn, all of these can be layered on top. So in a nutshell, those are some of the core areas. And I have a bunch of other things that I'd like to talk about, but I yield my time to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Vasudev. Thank you so much. Really useful inputs. Mr. Anup Mahapatra.
Yeah, thanks, Ram. Again, thanks to Professor Asa and the organizing committee giving the option to join as a panelist. So I'll just straight away go to this three questions: fintech, financial inclusion, the data governance, governing to the fintech. So right now, if you look into the fintech ecosystem, as it is being said, it is fintech 1.0. If you look into the whole gamut of the things, mostly the fintechs are correlated in the retail segment, in the banking space, as well as the payment ecosystem. Very few of them has entered into, as Mr. Basudev has rightly pointed out, very few of them have penetrated into the area of risk, cyber security, and other areas, which are more prominent into the governing days today. So looking into the commercial space also, there is a very limited penetration. So that is why it is being called as fintech 1.0. And moreover, they are also relying on the infrastructures which are put in place, the robust infrastructure, be it the UPI ecosystem, the RTGS, NEFT, and so on, the SWIFT ecosystem, the GSTN ecosystem. So they're borrowing or they're lending on the platforms which have been built in by this. And they're based on the niche technology which they have developed. They're harnessing the. But when we are thinking of a robust, future, really disruptive fintech ecosystem, which in my own personal view, as a career banker and working as the head of IT of State Bank of India, I have seen that the disruption which is being talked of is not that much. Disruption is going to come, maybe in another 2-3 years, but the foundation has already been laid. So that is what is the beginning. The disruption should be coming, but how that disruption will be coming? That disruption should be coming not through the point of competition between the banks and the fintechs or the ecosystem and the fintechs, rather by the strong degree of collaboration. Why it is so important? Because the whole data architecture, data system is all available with the original bankers, and it's a huge data set, but they're unable to derive insights, the value out of these data sets. That is what is the major challenge. And with the technology coming in through the fintech, that value generation can come. So that collaboration is essential. But looking into the governance part, what are the challenges? What are the areas of concern? Today, any innovation that is happening, for example, the vaccines which has come in the post-pandemic, but nobody knows what are the long-term implications of this pandemic because they are not well tested on a longer-term horizon. And that is exactly the same in case of fintech, because the fintechs have mostly come in the last 3-4 years. The number of fintechs have come in the last 3-4 years, though credit card comes in the year 1950s, the INB has come in the 90s, the payment ecosystem changes have come in the last 2 decades, but still the major number of fintechs have come just in the last 3-4 years. So that is why there is, because of this mushrooming of fintechs, the technology part, the innovation technology which has been made, it has not been well tested. So there lies the governance framework which need to be robustly built in. If you look into 2 areas, there is no such concrete single regulation available for the governance of the fintech. Number one, that's the biggest challenge. There are multiple fragmented regulations. Similarly, there is no data governance frameworks. Forget about fintechs. From the banks also, there is no data governance framework which has been laid down also. So these are the major challenges, and the boundary lines have not been defined. Looking into the various data privacy bills coming in, the GDPR, the California Act also, the data privacy and the ethics of the data are coming as a major concern. How the fintechs will be binding themselves within this regulatory framework, but simultaneously enabling themselves to undertake innovations to make them sustainable and ensuring the business continues. So this is the biggest challenge, as you have rightly pointed out in your first introduction. This is the biggest challenge. What is that thin line between the regulatory framework as well as the innovation? Innovation has to continue. If India has to become a digital leader, the fintechs should be the backbone, and those innovations must continue. So the regulatory framework also need to ensure, but simultaneously we cannot compromise the privacy aspect, the ethical aspect of the data, what are the risk elements. So that is why the data risk maturity assessment comes of more prominence. Once we assess the data risk maturity, then we know that yes, these are the residual risks which is under the manageable risk component, and we have got a matrix to manage this kind of risk. So that why I'm saying all this, because we have introduced the same concept in State Bank of India. Being a pioneer both in the area of artificial intelligence, in the data governance framework also, we are the pioneers in the industry. And my chief data management officer is also the working member of the subcommittee of the data governance. So from scratch, we have laid down this framework, both in the terms of artificial intelligence as well as in the data governance. But all are in-house. And while I'm saying that in-house without any fintechs or anything, because we have got a 6,000 plus strong IT team. So that itself is a big component. So when SBI is dreaming of becoming a conglomerate tomorrow, naturally more dependency on the in-house technologies and in-house is of the paramount importance. But saying so, the niche technology which the fintechs are offering, there lies the extent of collaboration. So from my own experience, I do prescribe the data governance with innovation being at the forefront, but simultaneously not compromising the ethics and privacy is the call of the day. That the coming back to the financial inclusion side, yes, this is, as Mr. Bansal has rightly pointed out, this is one area where the penetration is very, very limited. Look into the microfinance. We have got very limited microfinance, organized microfinance activities. Mostly in the disorganized sector, nobody knows what is the extent of finance. But in SBA also, through the artificial intelligence models, we have also developed models for the financial inclusion. So same thing, the fintech ecosystem can also built in. The banks can collaborate. The other areas of collaboration can be the blockchain technology. And with APIs becoming of prime importance, naturally the API banking also will come quite handy in the days to come to bring a robust collaborative ecosystem. So that's from my side for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Anup. Again, thank you for sharing your inputs on all the three areas. I guess some of our follow-up questions we can probably spend a little more time on some of the aspects that you highlighted. May I now request Shinjini to share her opening remarks? Shinjini, you're on mute.
As well. Okay, so just as well, I was on mute because I was kind of dumbstruck a little bit. Coming after Mr. Mahapatra, where he talks about his 6,000, did you say, sir, technology team?
Yeah, 6,000 plus IT team.
Okay. Yeah. Because I don't know, but just before I set up my startup in February this year, I was at Citibank and I headed the consumer bank for Citi. And our total staff strength was 3,700. So I'm quite daunted by the size of your IT team. At this point of time, I am running a business that has altogether 20 people. I can tell you it is extremely building a fintech platform. So just listening to Mr. Mahapatra and Mr. Bhandarkar talk about the big picture, right? The large institutions, how are large institutions looking at the new technology? How are they dealing with this this whole sort of paradigm shift that seems like it will come, and we can all have different opinion on whether it's already happened yesterday and we are already catching up, or whether it will happen only after 2-3 years. We can have views and opinions on that. But I want to just highlight a few things before I get into, and I think it's better that we have a dialogue because it's afternoon and I'm sure people who are listening to us want a little more variety. I'm always very amused because I've had a diverse background. I've been a regulator, so I've been at RBI and I've seen that whole push on financial inclusion in those days when microfinance was the big thing getting built. And then subsequently, when the payment system got expanded, I happened to be at Paytm. So I've seen some of those critical moments of time in this economy when expansion of services has happened, primarily on the back of technology. So, the first round of private bank licensing in India is when I was in RBI. And I remember those, the private banks coming up, the conversion of HDFC and ICICI. Incidentally, I'm right now reading Tamal's Pandemonium because I'm doing a panel discussion with him on Saturday. So it was all coming back to me, all of my career, and how Indian financial system grew, and then how technology has always played the most major role in how financial services have expanded, right? Because banking used to be the thing where only people that had stable jobs used to have bank accounts, because those are the only people that could afford to walk into a bank, and the branch manager knew everybody, and that's the banking that used to happen before we had the first round of banking expansion. Foreign banks had like privileged clients. It was a privilege. We brought it down to it not being a privilege in two ways. One was the whole core banking technology, and India did get the advantage of the first round of technology expansion as well. I mean, when I was in Bank of America, we had, if I remember correctly, Infosys as our technology partner. In Citi, it was TCS. So these banks, and I'm not talking about India, I'm talking about globally. So these giant technology companies that we built were able to shape banking, not just in India, but across the globe. And I think we got the advantage of that expansion. But it behoves us to look back a little bit and think about what did that ecosystem create and what did it require? So, when Henry Ford builds the car, he builds the car, but somebody else builds the road. Somebody else creates a whole business around petroleum. Somebody else creates, business around car insurance. So everything creates its ecosystem. Financial services created its own ecosystem. And then you had these DSAs and DMAs, and especially in consumer banking, the banks already became the guardians of the consumers. So the front end was completely owned by the bank. The regulatory interface was completely owned by the bank. The P&L was owned by the bank. But at the back end, there was already a motley group of technology service providers, DSAs, DMAs, credit card companies, like a whole value chain of people that were making those wheels work, and bankers were managing that, right? And that, in my view, to some extent, it expanded banking, because you couldn't have all done it by yourself. Even with a large team of 6,000 people, I'm pretty sure SBI's expansion into rural, when I drive into interiors of Bihar or Odisha, I still find SBI, right? And those are not all branches that are manned by you. You also need external vendors, etc. And I think that defined how bankers thought of collaboration. So when they say collaboration, and I'm just going to take this on a little bit headlong, because I just want to make the conversation interesting more than anything else, that bankers' idea of collaboration is effectively to find a vendor, sign a very fat contract, which they expect vendors to not really, have any say in, and get going, because their capacity gets expanded, because they own the consumer, they own the data, they own the regulatory privilege. And that has somehow defined bankers' idea of collaboration. When we now think about, and I'm not saying this now because I'm a fintech company, I'm saying this because I have seen this problem from Citi, where again, I was sitting over a sequence of vendors and vendor management committees and that whole process of compliance and regulation and everything that it takes to run through hoops to partner with one tiny fintech for one tiny test. So we launched a credit card with Paytm when we were in Citi, because we wanted to underwrite new to credit customers, and there was just no way that we could have done it. We just did not have the capacity, even if we wanted to. So we went ahead and created that product. It required so much jumping through hoops to, outsourcing guidelines, technology integrations, their APIs, our APIs, their understanding, their engineers, our engineers, their credit risk appetite, our risk appetite. There is just hundreds and thousands. So sometimes it's like oil and water coming together, but you make it work because both parties do want to take advantage of the strength that each one has. Banks definitely continue to have the regulatory clout. They continue to have the trust. They continue to have client front end, and therefore collaborations still continue. I want to just challenge that to say that I think we will have to start looking at this very, very differently. These will change. There is a particular reason why when you see the startup ecosystem, when you see the fintech ecosystem, maximum amount of scale and maximum amount of capital investment has happened in the payment space. And the reason for that is that payments is the new child. It is almost a technology that does not suffer from the legacy problem that the banking technology suffers from. And therefore, the amount of money, this morning I went for the Paytm, listing ceremony, and whatever you may think about it, the fact of the matter is that the immense amount of capital that has flown into startups has flown into that space because of the future ability to kind of harness that technology for the benefit of actual users. We can say what we like, but the fact is that capital also follows a logic. It's not always dumb. It's not always just that people are thinking about dumb metric. So I think, and then we think about credit, right? So that you see the disruption that has happened in retail space. It has happened in spaces where there is least dependence on these, collaborations and partnerships. Of course, you will want to go and collaborate and partner because you have no other way to do it. So today, as a fintech, if I want to offer any product, I cannot offer it because every product requires a license. To get a license, I need to get capital. It's a chicken and egg issue. Unless I try something, test something, bring it onto the platform, I cannot raise more capital to scale it. And I cannot even get to the trial stage because I don't have the license to try it. We don't have sandboxes in India. We don't have, those sort of infrastructure that exists for us to be able to do that. And throughout this conversation for the rest of the evening, I will keep swapping between my fintech role and my banker role. And very rarely, but the regulatory hat that I have worn for 17 years. So it's not a small amount. It's not easy to just give it up. But just to make the point that I think the ecosystem needs to change its attitude and begin to understand that this is not about DSAs, DMAs. This is not about an agent signing an agreement. This is not about principal agent relationships. So, I mean, to expect a Citibank and a Paytm credit card to operate under a principal agent relationship, which is the current regulatory architecture, where if a mistake is made, the principal is responsible, is a fallacy of a very different order, right? And those infrastructures, that ecosystem development has not been thought of because interests are not aligned. Interests are not aligned on, and to me, I think fierce competition should be the way forward for best practices to emerge and for the most, for the fittest to survive. But fierce competition cannot happen because the licenses that are required to do any business in financial services are rationed out. And therefore, there will never be that competition. And I'm not talking about, so in the payment space, for example, and I keep going back to the payment space because that's the newest space. And it's interesting how much competition exists. So what is happening with Paytm today is, despite all that capital, despite all that cloud, all that wonderful, product building, today there is, Bharat Pay, there is the whole UPI architecture, there is Google Pay, there is WhatsApp Pay, and therefore there's fierce competition. Prices are already at zero, and still there is competition to acquire clients and see what can you do on top of that and what can you build on top of that, etc. That level of competition does not exist in wealth. It does not exist in liabilities, definitely. And until that happens, you will continue to think that somebody else will come and do the financial inclusion bit. Okay. But why? It's all of our job to do that, right? A customer is a customer, whether that customer happens to be from India 1 or India 2 or India 55. A customer is a customer. Every customer deserves the best service. Every customer deserves to get advantage of the best technology. Again, going back to the payment example, whether that, they keep bringing up this beggar on the road using Paytm versus, anybody. So I use the exact same app that my driver uses to transfer money between us. Like, that's the wonderful thing about UPI. That's the wonderful thing about payment. It's not graded. It's not a graded experience. So the point that I'm trying to make is that let's look at the new technology and the development of this new ecosystem with all the infrastructure development that has happened, with a slightly new way of seeing it, because that will make it a revolution. Otherwise, we are constantly constraining it from every side. The water flows through pipes and then it becomes very narrow and then suddenly it bursts from somewhere and then there is one data leak. And then everybody is jumping around that, trying to press that and say, oh, this did not exist, or it happens only in a bank, or it happens only in a fintech. And it's not, and I don't think that's the right way that we will continue to grow.
Yeah. Thank you, Srinjini. I think a lot of points, and as you rightly said, maybe some of the positions that you have articulated would require, some amount of deliberation, because I'm sure there are multiple perspectives to what
I just thought I'll do a little bit of your job because we.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So I just hope we have sufficient time left to explore all of them in a fair amount of detail. But before we jump in there into the most exciting part, but I think we would love to hear Mr. Krishnan also give his brief opening remarks before we jump into a more discussion format.
Thank you, Sriram. Thanks a lot. And it was great hearing all the experts here. So I'll just try 1 or 2 points. See, something that we have done fantastic over the last few years is done something strategically right, tying it up with opening of the bank accounts and running both of these as massive national programs with as a blitz across the country. So we laid the basic infrastructure and processes and did that tying up all sorts of stakeholders. So we now have that entire ecosystem, which is well understood by people. And having put this in place, we also put the basic mechanisms for transacting on them, which is like payments. And that was done in a whole interoperable way. So at one stroke, you have an interoperable base, not just the basic receptacles for people to hold their money and all that, but also the basic processes and mechanisms to transact digitally on the basic payment mechanism. So this has been done. And as Shinjini said, the payment space has brought in suddenly a lot of money because there's a huge lot of expectation. The expectation that, hey, this is a 1.3 billion population country, 1.35 billion. And they have done all of this so well. So I'm sure they will do the other things also there. But the key point here is that how are you going to touch the vast majority of this country? Something which Rajesh also mentioned here is that there are today large parts of the country which today are not really engaging with this. How do you get them to engage with it? Because this 1.3 billion story will unfold only if they start engaging. So you still talk about AI and stuff and data and all of that. So this is just putting more and more on the top 30%, which is already engaged, well engaged, right? So how do you get the other people to engage with them? And that is where we got to look at those parts of it. And there it is, I think, critical that we go slightly beyond just the financial and the transaction part of it. Because when we look at the top half of the country or the top quarter of the country, already people understand money, they understand banking, they're literate, and they already have their salaries coming into bank accounts. All of that is there. Now, in the second half of the story, the bottom half, what we need to now do is how do you tie up these financial transactions with people's livelihoods? So if there is a woman selling milk, how do you tie it with a livelihood? If 65% of the country, 70% of the countries today depend on agriculture, how is that entire agriculture economy going to become digital? Because that is when you'll tie up those transactions with your financial transactions. So that whole story of digitizing a whole segment of our economy, on that depends this dream of 1.3 billion. How do you get all of them to transact digitally? How do they start engaging? And therefore, what do you do about the 65% of the country which is there in the villages? How do you make these things work here? So people talk a lot about this amazing growth in payments transactions across the country. Globally, it's just a fantastic story. But when we went into a deeper analysis of this, and when you look at it across, all of this is just concentrated in a few districts in a few states across the country. It is so highly concentrated that it's not a joke. I mean, you just have to see how highly concentrated it is, the entire digital payment transfer. So this whole UPI story, people transacting, there are whole districts of the country, whole parts of states are not even touched. So that is both a good and a bad story. The good thing is that there's a huge promise out there yet to be tapped because this growth is going to happen. But the challenge is how do you make them transact? And you will not make them transact by just bombarding them with more and more advertisements, do this, do that. It's not going to work because there is no link between how he makes his living and his livelihood as a farmer to this whole story which you're talking about. We have not connected this at all. And for connecting this, somebody has to make that investment in creating that ecosystem. Just like, again, getting back to what Shinji said, who is going to do the financial inclusion? People say somebody will come along and do it. No, all these people who have brought in huge capital have to start thinking about it because this 1.3 billion story will not unfold till you fix that. Till you create a digital ecosystem around agri, till you create a digital ecosystem on rural life. It's not just enough that you open an account for a woman in the village. You have to understand what is it, how does she make her livelihood? How can you help her make her livelihood? How do you see what loan she gets and how can she repay it? So it is not just as a bank, we go and say, hey, I'm giving you the loan, I'm looking at your thing, no, you can't pay. The story is how can I help you to pay? How can I improve your business? How can you get it to the market? How can I aggregate your produce digitally and take it through an e-market? So I have to create this whole business for them and then start lending to them. So the whole story is that you have to do a lot more with this bottom half to realize this story. And that is why it is essential, I feel, that as we move forward, as digital, as the fintech and the banks, also the fintech, we start also working more closely with the government and other people who are today willing and very eager to make investments in this segment. How do you ensure that these investments in the rural fintech infrastructure, in the base, is happening in a way that it is conducive to lending and stuff like that, right? For example, Rajesh Mansal said there's a whole lot of things today happening in the physical world. How do I make it digital? That's very important. So if you look at the self-help groups across the country, there are 7 crore women transacting in self-help groups across 70 lakh SHGs. This is more than the population of many countries. Have you ever thought all these transactions that you're doing physically, how do I make it digital? Because there's a huge opportunity there. So we have to work with that ecosystem. We have to look at the crores who are in farming. How do I ensure that I buy the produce from him and pay him digitally, and aggregate them into groups which are conducive to lending? So it is, the future story is not just tech, it is not just blockchain, AI and all that. It is a whole lot of socially conscious work, social conscious work, along with technology, along with understanding people. All of this is going to get involved to really make the fintech story big in this country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Krishnan. I guess great opening remarks and comments, and I just pick up 2-3 broad flavors, I guess, given that we have some time left and we also need to also engage the audience. But 2-3 broad flavors, I guess Shinjini touched upon the whole, bank versus fintech. Is it a collaborative space? Do we really see it as a collaborative space? Or do we have a very narrow definition of it being a collaborative space? Which parts of fintech and I think there's also a question by Ashok Nagraj, similar, who has pulled up on the chat. Rajesh, if I were to throw this at you and ask you to take a shot at it, and maybe dwell upon this whole fintech versus bank, but that's one certain debate which is there in the minds of many, and also given the fact that banks do suffer some legacy systems, etc. But having said it, they have an advantage of being, regulatorily, having certain advantages with respect to what fintechs can do and cannot do, or vice versa, right? So that range of debates, challenges. So, do you see fintechs and banks collaborating? If yes, what could be areas where they could, and where are they competing, and where would they eventually compete? So, if you could give a little more take on what would play out going forward, because I guess we're in the very initial stages right now. What would be your take on that?
Thanks, Chidan. I'm glad that you tempered the expectations, because today everybody says as if fintechs are driving the Indian financial sector. And I always ask people, is it their valuations you're talking about, or are you talking about the number of people they have touched? So Mr. Mahapatra said, currently we are a bank-led model. And the banks, to be honest, not just because I've been a regulator for 25 years, they have done a great job. Now, coming to your question on competition versus collaboration, there is no doubt that it will be collaboration. There are banks who are already taking steps. However, the collaboration models and the frameworks are still very, very nascent. And the number of banks I speak to, they still feel the fintech is a threat, which is definitely not the case. And just to bring in the innovation hub, which has just been set up by RBI, that is also my job, to see how do we ensure that there is at scale collaboration between fintechs and banks, because no more, the bank is no more a black box, which it used to be when you started core banking systems. Banks do realize that gradual modularization of financial services has happened, where various, take a simple example. When RBI allowed video KYC, it was possible for a State Bank of India or a Union Bank to build that, but they did not opt for it. And they leveraged the new fintechs who have actually come out with great video KYC solutions. It just helped them scale up video KYC in a big way. So I would say, in terms of obviously lending, the loan origination systems, even loan management systems, the consumer experience and the agility which the fintechs offer, it is something which will a win-win for banks and fintechs as we go along. Although, you know, in India, there are a lot of people who come and tell me it's the end of banking. I personally don't think it's the end of banking. It's a transformation of banking or transformation of financial services, because instead of using the word bank, which means we are excluding fintechs, that is definitely going to take place, because today's digital natives, the digital first consumers, my young team, they only want everything digitally done. And banks do have their own challenges in terms of HR. And Shirang, you know, I would like to have an offline conversation with you on this. The HR challenges being a huge reason why sometimes bank might find a challenge. Net, it's a great story. I'm sorry I'm repeating it. Last 10 years, the government of India built critical public infrastructure, open digital infrastructure, and the banks and the fintechs can make it a great story as we go along, you know, working in a collaborative way.
Yeah. So thank you, Rajesh. And I'm going to push this to Anup because he represents the behemoth SBI. Anup, a slightly controversial point. Building on what Rajesh didn't say that, so I'm putting words to it now. Would this really mean, I won't say end of banking or banks, because I'm sure some banks would, would it mean end of some banks? And what would it mean for those banks, and why would it be, what kind of challenges should bank be ready for, or what changes they should be doing if what Rajesh said, that there is a debate which is on to say that the entry of fintech could be ending of banks, but we all agree that it won't be banks as such, but it could be some banks, so maybe since you have represented a large institution, I guess 250 to 300,000 employees, with a lot of other challenges, you would be the best person to maybe share your perspective on how do we see banks responding to this challenge.
Yeah, I will address from 2 points. One is from the State Bank point of view, and from the other public sector banks point of view, very specifically. From State Bank point of view, if you see that last 2 decades is a technological transformation. So today, because of the time constraint, just to give a feel of the things, 94% of our transactions are going through the digital channel. Only 6% of the transactions, or even less than 6% of the transactions, are going through the physical branch channel. So that is the kind of massive technological transformation which has facilitated this. Today, SBI is also the pioneer in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We have got 50 plus machine learning models, starting from scratch way back 3 years back in today, generating huge amount of revenue from the organization, both in terms of profit as well as shareholder value. If we can value it, it will be much higher than multiple unicorns. So that, but unfortunately, there is not a valuation system. We are also the pioneer in the industry. So far the data governance framework is concerned, we have got a comprehensive data strategy having 4 different distinct pillars, because the SBI with a legacy bank having a data quality as the major concern. So that is pillar number 1, which I've addressed: data infrastructure, data governance, and data analytics. So these 4 pillars we have simultaneously attacked, and we became the pioneer with multiple policies, frameworks, procedures, data leakage policies, data sharing, data access, and ultimately landing at the data risk maturity assessment model. So each of our data element, we have got a risk assessment model assigned to that particular data. So that is what, when I introduced myself in my first interaction, that the fintech ecosystem tomorrow is not the ecosystem I'm visualizing, is an ecosystem which will be governed robustly by the data governance framework. Otherwise, most of the fintechs also will perish with the stringent guidelines, regulatory framework that would be coming in place in due course of time. So that is what I had given a call also, that innovation also cannot be killed. So there has to be a thin balance. Looking into the SBI, I don't foresee the challenges for SBI, because if you look into YONO as a platform that is developed comprehensively in-house, without any fintech, without any startup, or without anything. And it's a mega ecosystem with a huge valuation and huge amount of digital transaction going through seamlessly online with multiplicity of transactions.
If I may come in, sir, for a second, and just just for the interest of time, I mean, no doubt about the huge amount of progress SBI has done, and clearly, sir, on all fronts, including your app, YONO, etc., I'm sure is probably the best in class in the market. But if given your experience of how you really transformed SBI to respond to the challenges in the marketplace, what would be your advice to banks as such to really what should they watch out for? Should they not slip into a process where they are not able to stay competitive? So that
So
I
that is
think
exactly what I'm coming to. So basically, the guidance is that the vision that we need to have put in place, that we should remain ahead of the curve. So there has to be a significant investment in the technology with a clear board-approved vision, backed by missions and various action points in multiple areas. The principles of buy and build, which one will be built in-house, which one has to be bought immediately so that there will be a first mover advantage. So these are the strategic orientations that need to be put in place. And any such bank which will be missing these areas, these principles, obviously over a period of time will be likely to be not there in the system. So that is what is the thought process, which SBA has showcased, even though it's a legacy bank, so-called legacy bank long back. But that is what is the principles we need to put in place. And there has to be a strong board with a strong governance mechanism that has to lead from the front.
Sure. So, one of the points which I think Krishnan made, and I'm sure all the other speakers made, Vasudev also touched upon it, is this whole, ability for us to serve the underserved. In fact, Rajesh touched upon it. A large part of India, which probably does not get served as well, and how do you really involve them and include them into the whole process? And if I may, maybe extend it a bit more, maybe there is a difference between what we see as a technical challenge and adaptable challenge. And Krishnan, you had kind of touched upon that to say that, we need to understand the needs and respond to those needs and not just look at it as a technical challenge. And, a small, experiment which we did in a village called Akodra in Gujarat, where we try to digitize a complete village and digitize payments. And we found that while the technology infrastructure we were able to provide, in a very short period of time, the offtake of using digital payments was not that fast. And we found that the women, found it very difficult because, cash does flow, and most of the women there were actually working and making money. But the cash which they're getting paid would normally sometimes be taken by the men folk for the other purposes of drinking, etc., etc. Now, when you made it digitized, the access to cash became limited and led to some amount of challenges within the societal structures, and hence we found women being a bit more cautious before they were to adopt some of the technology. So what I'm trying to highlight is that often we miss the adaptable challenges of how societies have to respond to digitization and maybe see it as just a technical challenge. So keeping that in mind, Vasudev, if you could maybe share your take on what should and could India or Indian fintechs or Indian banks do differently in order to really expand this whole digital, ecosystem or benefits to get a larger part of India to really play into it. And if I can flip that further, and maybe Shinjini, you can come in there, because one of the key segments that's underserved are the women in India. And and clearly you have, started an organization that's focused on, serving the women. So maybe you could also come in later to share as to what are some of the adaptable challenges that we miss out on while we try to serve them just by looking at it as a technical challenge. So probably Vasudev first, and then I'll come to Shinjini. And then maybe Krishnan, you can take a shot at it later.
It's, it must be said, whatever Mr. Mohapatra has talked about, it's mind-boggling, that he has put such a vast army to very good use and starting to build technologies from scratch. But what's going on in my mind, sitting here in the US, is I don't know how much you are aware, but digital transformation is one of the very big enterprise software movements right now in the US. And India has a golden opportunity already to start from scratch. India can leapfrog the US, and India can leapfrog other countries. But you want, if you think about what is digital transformation and what is the the whole process of incorporating new technologies such as AI to automate the whole thing. And automation is not about putting people out of work, but automation is about making their experiences better. So think about, if the US has a digital transformation problem, think about what kind of problem India may have, given where it started from and where it wants to go. I'm thinking about all the business processes. So there's people, there's processes, and there's there is the institutions and the culture. So if you want to, for example, write down things on a piece of paper and get them out, you mentioned about your experiment in the village. It's getting that end user to accept that there's nothing else that needs to be done on their part. But think about the institutions problem. In order for that to happen, there are, State Bank is just one such example. I mean, how many other banks are at the grassroots, from Citibank to Punjab National Bank to, I don't know, there are like at least 100+ banks. Each of them have to participate in the system. Each of those officers have to move away from paper-based processes to digital processes. You have to put a security infrastructure on top. India has made a lot of progress, yes. But I think there is, I would say, a very long, arduous journey ahead, especially at the back-end infrastructure side, because to convert paper-based systems and human interactive processes to digital-based systems, where you don't need, there's like no touch, no code type of system. I think that's where the biggest challenges will take place. It's the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the problems that need to be solved are ahead before everything fits together. Fintechs have sucked the oxygen out of the PR system with their ads and the amount of money and the valuations, but I think the journey has just begun, in my opinion. As from a data governance perspective and digital transformation perspective. If there's no digital transformation at the very grassroots, you will not have financial inclusion for at least a couple more decades. That's how I see it.
Yeah, thank you, Sudev. I think that's good input. So Srinjini, I would, since you are on the ground, you're doing it yourself. How do you, obviously all of us agree that there should be digital transformation that has to happen on the grassroots for making this. Can you share some story or, something that you could help us understand how should one go about it and what could be some of the challenges one faces while going through this transformation?
So I want to make a couple of things clear. One is that I want to talk to something which Mr. Krishnan said earlier about, when you go to actually solve the problem of that in an ecosystem that requires help, like what we call financial inclusion traditionally, that is a very different, that requires a very different problem solving skills. So I have a very dear friend, and you might have heard of her, Chetna Gala Sinha, who runs this bank called Mandeshi Bank in a place called Mandeshi in Maharashtra. And I actually went to her place to see how they do this. And I've traveled a lot to Rajasthan and Bihar and various small places to actually understand what are the success models. By the way, the company that I'm building, which is Salt or My Salt app, I'm not building it at this stage for the rural microfinance beneficiary. The product that I'm currently building is actually targeted at the millennial and Gen Z young women who, despite education, continue to face the gender gap in finance. So the gender gap in finance is not limited to the poor. So we will just first admit that issue. It continues to run through the wealthiest families to the middle class women to women who work at, and that comes primarily from the fact that your work at home is not remunerated work. So all the free work of care, of sustenance comes in the share of women and is unpaid. And all the work that is paid somehow comes in the share of men, so much so that even if cooking is remunerated, chefs are male. But when it is free, then it is women. So when you have to give care at home to an elderly, you are the bahu. But if you have to go and give care outside, then it can be a man or a woman. So essentially, the fact that ownership of money has these gender-based biases plays into financial services and their acceptance of women as clients, right? So that's a very different problem that we are trying to solve at Salt, because we realize that if you don't close the gender gap at the top, you are not creating the correct network effects, and you're not. So obviously we will use everything at our command, which could be artificial intelligence, which could be data, which could be network effects, because when you want to build a digital business, you have to build it at scale. You have to find the users who will develop their own ecosystem, take their own charge, because it is essentially built on the principle of do it yourself, right? So I'm not going to go and do it for that girl. She's going to do it herself. So I need somebody who has a smartphone. I need somebody who understands English, because that's the language of my app. And I don't have to be defensive about it. It's a problem to solve. We're doing it. The point that I'm coming back to is what I learned from traveling through Rajasthan and Bihar and going to Chetna's place and staying and talking to people and learning, is that when you want to solve these problems, you need to actually understand the users, right? It's about design. Like right now, we are a design focused company, we are a design obsessed company. The problem we are trying to solve of gender gap in the women, design is a very important aspect. How do you not talk down to that girl? That girl has gone to the same college, same St. Stephen's and St. Xavier's and Yale and Harvard that her brother or her boyfriend or her husband has gone. But yet she faces financial, the gender gap in finance. So you can't look down upon her, you can't patronize her, you can't give her the financial inclusion talk, and yet you want to get her as a client. So that's a very different design problem. The design problem that I see Chetna solving, which I have an immense amount of respect for, to her and to other people who are trying to do that, is they effectively actually understand the lifestyles of these women. So they don't go and say, like, I'm sorry to pick on you, Srirang, but or your bank, but they don't go and say that I'm going to set the goal to take this village and convert it into fully digital, and now if it causes you inconvenience, then you have a problem. My goal is to make this village digital. They actually go and understand what is it that works for these women, and why is it that they like cash, and if they like cash for a specific reason, and that cannot change, then we will not change it until such time as that underlying reason changes. So just to close my statement, when I was in Paytm, I actually did a partnership with Chetna, as well as with Dilli Haat in Delhi, which you might know is another place where people come and sell their wares. They were so outstanding at training these people. Chetna does a annual sale here at in Bombay, where all her artisans and all her women farmers and everybody turns up and they sell things and in massive quantities, and it's a very interesting experience again. But she manages to teach everybody how to accept money using Paytm and Google Pay, because she knows that the clients who will come at that fair will be using Google Pay and Paytm, and therefore they need to learn. I've had situations where I have paid money to somebody, that person hasn't got the money and gotten very nervous about it, and then they immediately said, how do I solve for this? Because they don't know whether they got their 200 rupees or not. And there is actually a human being there who goes around and asks and solves that problem. So you are not going to be able to solve this problem if you don't understand lifestyles, preferences, etc., etc. And that will vary from community to community, that will vary from class to class. So we can't set goals as a nation to say everybody must become digital or every institution must do something. We have a role for things. I think the idea is to make it much more and I personally think that one of the biases we have in our regulatory system, Rajesh, I have to pick on you because I picked on everybody, and that's my job today, is to sit here and pick on people. So I have to say this, that one of the fallacies in our regulatory system, and I used to protest about it even when I was in RBI, is that we think that anybody who can afford it is not worth thinking of as a customer. Matlab, if you are rich, then why should I bother about you? I am only going to bother about the poorest of the poor. Now, that's a very good thing to have at your heart. But reality is that network effects travel from influence. You have to have people that have. Why did Paytm became such a big thing? Because, you know, Uber users started to use it. Uber users were all elite, but they started to use it one way or another, and then it creates that momentum. So I think one of the things we have is that we are very anti, we put everybody in the privilege bucket, in so much so that when we started Salt and we wanted to get access data on women, and it continues to befuddle everybody, right? Why women's participation in labor force in India continues to go down. In most countries it goes down and then it comes back up, but in India it's going like this. So when we started to look for data, you only get microfinance data. You only get data and studies about women in the micro. And I have nothing against them. By the way, I come from a poor background. I'm a Bihari woman. My relatives are microfinance beneficiaries. I have nothing against them. But it just really annoys me that nobody even bothers to think that problems are, problem pockets are not just all focused on that space.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Thank you, Shinjini. I guess you made a very important point, and I think I'm sure many in the audience would possibly open up to the point that often we look at challenges only from a one view, and that women even in the educated metro and through the best of colleges could also be people who suffer biases and hence need to be served. I think is certainly something, and maybe it's a societal bias, and maybe that's something that you've highlighted. And thanks for bringing it up. Since you picked on me, just one clarification, just to put the record straight. The intention was not to digitize the village, but I think the unintended consequences sometimes, when you think you're doing good, I think can be missed out, and that I think is an important aspect, because when you go in with a design, you want to do good, but you often miss out on some of the unintended consequences, and that's extremely important. And that's exactly the point that you highlighted, is to keep that as part of the design input, and design when you really go back and look at those kind of interventions of inclusion. Now, I know we're running out of time, but I've got two themes to explore a bit more. One on data governance, and I'm going to ask a very simple but very tough question. And I can say that for sure, across, and this probably is more true for Indian organizations, because culturally, we do not have the discipline of data governance. When I say that, and I say that even as an HR guy, that our salaries and other information that otherwise is supposed to be confidential are most talked about in the system, because the moment I launch my bonuses for the year, it's about in 24 hours, everyone knows everyone's salary, and it's very transparent in sharing information to each other. Now, when you have culturally, people are not tuned to really holding on, especially in the world of tomorrow, where a significant amount of data and data privacy will be required for us to really ensure that customers are comfortable working with us. How does one really go about building a culture of data governance in a corporation, and what could be a couple of tools that have got used? And I'll probably shoot this at Rajesh and Anup to come in and share their points at it.
Anup sir, you want to go first?
No, please carry on.
Okay. So I do agree with you, Srirang, that obviously as a culture, as a society, we are not used to data privacy, data governance, and having been at the center of this when I was a founding team of Aadhaar. Honestly, ask me, everybody and then uncle would wake up one day and say Aadhaar does not respect privacy. I'm not defending, but just to tell you, the only public institution where privacy by design was there. But having said that, I suppose the data protection bill and the DPA that comes into being after that will play a critical role over this decade, to set the right data frameworks, to ensure that organizations and individuals thereafter will follow, standards, and there'll be greater public trust. It's similar to what happened after the IT Act. It took a decade plus for institutions and organizations to realize what Information Technology Act says. And similarly, so I am very keen, as I said, PDP bill will be the key point at which India's data framework and governance will improve. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rajesh. Anup?
Yeah, just to say this, let me just highlight the strategy that I have adopted in establishing the data governance plan, which will be maybe academically interesting for others also. We didn't have a framework at all. The concept was completely new 3 years back. So we had formulated a policy, got it approved by the board, created a data governance framework with 4 different pillars, which I've already narrated, then established a governance department under the Chief Data Management Officer, created governance councils right from the top, led by chairman, up to the branch level to generate tremendous level of awareness, then generated a lot of policies, procedures, data leakage policies, data sharing, data access, created data dictionaries, harmonization of data dictionaries, concept of single source of truth, and ultimately the data risk maturity assessment model to assess the risk of each data. And finally, to make it universal across the bank, we celebrate 1st of June as the Data Governance Day. So this is what is the transformation from the scratch till today. And our Chief Data Management Officer is also a member of the sub-working group of the Reserve Bank of India on data governance. So because there is no such framework right now, regulatory framework in place. So saying so, it is, as Rajesh has rightly pointed out, it will be a decade to imbibe the concept. But if the PDP laws will be stringent and the penalties will be really prohibitive, naturally the implementation of the data governance will be very, very robust. Maybe in 2-3 years' time, it will be clearly embedded in the entire organizational ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anup. Now, let me just move on to one last theme. And Krishnan, I would request if you could take this up. This whole space of fintech, or technology or financial inclusion, etc., will require explosive requirement in terms of skilled manpower. And and given the fact that today, while there is a lot of availability of raw talent, skilling itself is becoming a big challenge, because most universities, as one may say, are not necessarily aligning the curriculum. And today, we hire, I'm giving my example, we hire a lot of engineers from various campuses, but the curriculum which they go through is possibly what was there 20 years back, 25 years back. So from a structural perspective, what kind of vocationalization do you see in the space? What role do you see academia playing? What role do you see industry playing in really skilling? So, your take on what could be some examples or some models that India could explore if you really want to solve this problem, because I see this really becoming a great challenge which could come in the way of explosive growth if you don't really fix the supply of skilled manpower in this space.
Yeah, Srirang, we are also battling with this. So to that extent, I am all sympathy for you. We are also working and battling for talent. And the good thing which I see in this, which I tell all my colleagues here, is that for once talent is getting recognized. For once the person who is actually there at the bottom doing the stuff, and not necessarily the person who is interfacing with the client. This guy who is doing is now getting his due, and he is actually bargaining for it. And so there will be some kind of a restructuring the way scales are there across the economy, and the technology skills will come up. Some quick ideas which I had on this was, one is that probably which is talked about, but we should have a stronger kind of an internship kind of model with the universities, which setting apart a significant amount of time out of the 4 years that they do to work closely with industries who are at the thick of it. And the industry also creates a program where it is able to induct these people and work collaboratively and in a win-win kind of situation with them. It is possible because we also work in some of these areas with combination technology, financial inclusion. We have found this possible. But one point which I will say as an engineer myself, I have struggled with it. And today both my daughters went through engineering, the same thing, they struggle with it. And I would like to just plead for one thing. Out of those 4 years, the first year is spent again almost entirely on studying physics, chemistry, and maths. No, everybody does physics, chemistry, and maths to get into engineering. Having tested them inside out on this, and having known that this guy is not going to do physics, chemistry for his life, he's probably going to get into fintech. He already has his dream set. He's got, why are you again wasting 1 year? And you can actually grab 1 year from the life of all these engineers. Can you imagine 1 year of life from each one of them doing something which is absolutely of no use? Whatever foundation they wanted in physics, 11th and 12th, those fellows have got it. Whatever is required is enough. KMNO4 and the catalysis and titrations, enough for a lifetime. So let us free them. And that 1 year, if it can be given over for something which is more industry facing, let us start on their specialization towards IT, towards tech from the first. And let us recognize today that IT is a big job earner. It's going to transform the country. There is digital transformation. Work more closely with the industry and creatively. And if some profs have to be retrained in the process, let us retain them. We don't make children go through something just because the profs need employment. They can find other means of getting them, but we need to get the full 4 years out of them in a way that is market facing. Just quickly, I thought I'll mention that, Sriram.
No, I think you resonate so much, Krishnan, and technically on paper, so am I an engineer. And I still remember after 4 years of industrial engineering, I walked into a shop floor when I started my career as a graduate engineer trainee, looking at machines as if I look at them for the first time in life. Right? So that is, unfortunately, that's not true for doctors. I hope it is not true ever for doctors.
Yes.
It's not true for lawyers, but certainly true for engineers. So I resonate a lot with what you said, and I think there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done there. I know we've run short of time, and but I think we've captured a lot of inputs, and we are at I think 5:45, and I should respect the time of the audience. So, Professor Saloni, I had a couple of more questions, but unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to cover the syllabus today. So, Professor Saloni, back to you.